Hi, thank you for joining me for my 5-minute Bible study today. Today we continue in the book of Colossians, and we're still in chapter 1, but we're towards the end now. We're going to start that last section in chapter 1 that starts in verse 24 and goes on to verse 29. So go ahead and take a look at that entire section. So when we go through 24, you'll have the full context of what we're talking about. And speaking of context, just to remind us of the past context, remember that Paul started this letter by introducing himself and Timothy, by giving credit to Epaphras for building the church down in Colossae, and then also for praising the Colossian church. He then moved forward into explaining who Jesus is, the eternal God, the creator God, the head of the church, the firstborn of the dead. And so we see that who Jesus is, and then he explains finally that we can be reconciled to him through his death on the cross. And so that's what Paul has talked to us about up to this point. At the end of verse 23, we see a slight transition moving into what we're going to talk about now. And in that verse, he says that I am a minister of that gospel that has gone throughout the world. Now recognize that going throughout the world means the Gentile nations. It's not just a Jewish thing here. It's for all the world. It's for all the Gentiles. And so Paul is the apostle of the Gentiles. And so he's making that point in verses 24 to 29. This is who I am. I am the apostle of the Gentiles. So I am teaching you truth, the truth of Jesus Christ. These other teachers that are coming in and teaching different things than I am, they are false teachers. And at some point, Colossians, you're going to have to make a choice. Are you going to believe me, or are you going to believe the false teachers? And so as he makes that case, he starts the case by saying, this is who I am. I'm an apostle of Jesus Christ. So let's go ahead and take a look at verse 24 and see what Paul actually says. He says, now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I do my share on behalf of his body, which is the church, in filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. So we're going to take a look and go back there. It starts with now, and now basically tells us Paul's moving forward. Now, here's what I want to say. This is what I said before. Now, I'm going to move forward and say what I want to say. So it starts a new section. And he says, I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. So Paul has been suffering for the church. And even now, as he writes this, he's in prison. If you recall, we mentioned that in the introduction. And this is a prison epistle. And so Paul has been writing this in prison. And not just imprisonment, but beatings, tortures, a whole bunch of sufferings that Paul has gone through to get to this point. And so Paul's explaining that he has been doing this suffering for the church, as opposed to the false teachers who are having fun, enjoying life. Paul has been suffering for what he believes. And not only that, though, not only does he suffer, but he says, I rejoice. So recognize that. Our rejoicing, our joy does not come from our circumstances. Our joy comes from something much bigger and much deeper. Happiness comes from our circumstances. I'm happy because everything's good in my life right now. Everything falls apart in my life, I'm very unhappy. But I still can have joy even while everything's falling apart in my life, because joy isn't based on circumstance. Joy is based on something much, much bigger. In our case, as Christians, joy is based on what we believe is going to happen for us in the future. That no matter what happens to us here on this earth, that we know we have a future that is eternal with God. And so we look forward to that. That's our hope. And so we look forward to that, to the resurrection of our bodies, and that one day we will overcome death. And that's our hope, and that's what we look forward to. So it doesn't matter what happens now. We don't have to be happy or joyful or unjoyful based on this. We can have joy even in the midst of suffering. And that's what Paul's showing us here. So he says, not only has he done that, but he says at the end of this verse, he says that what is he doing? He's filling up what is lacking in Christ's affliction. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's different thoughts on that. One thought is that in the Jewish thought, that there would needed to be an amount of pain before the end of time. There needed to be an amount of suffering before the end of time. And so many scholars believe that that's what Paul's pointing at, and they're saying that Paul's noticing that the suffering that Christ has done, it's sufficient for salvation, but it's not sufficient to end time. And so Paul suffering adds to that. So he's adding to that and he's filling it up. But that's one idea. Another idea is just simply that nothing's wrong with Christ's affliction. It's sufficient for salvation. But without Paul telling us about the gospel, nobody would know about it. So what's he doing? He's filling us up, the church up, with the understanding of Christ's affliction, what the cross actually meant. So those are the options that we have as we think about that phrase. It could mean either one of them, but in any case, it doesn't change the gospel message that Christ's cross is enough for salvation. So with that, we'll leave you there. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to coming back with you tomorrow again to go into verse 25. If you have any questions, put them at the end in the comments. Thank you very much. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And until that time, God bless you.